As I have presented so far, the conservative movement was not a movement. Certainly wasn't a movement by 1940. You did have opposition to going into the war. There was the America First Committee, but that was not conservative, it was anti-Roosevelt. There were traditional liberals in it, old-style 19th century liberals in it. There were pacifists in it who probably were progressives, who legitimately probably could be called Darwinists. But they didn't want to go into the war. They were convinced that Roosevelt was planning to take the country into a war, and they opposed it, and most Americans agreed with them. And that became a major political issue after the war, the whole question of why did we go to war? And the American First Committee openly and effectively opposed the expansion of war powers. But on December 7th, 1941, all opposition ceased. The American people switched. They were going to fight the Japanese. And because Hitler made the worst decision probably of the 20th century the following Thursday by declaring war on the United States, enabled Roosevelt to concentrate on the European war instead of the Pacific. And once you're in wartime, everybody pulls together. You don't have political opposition, at least on the fundamental issues. Wartime spending becomes dominant, wartime planning becomes dominant, centralization is overwhelming because war really is the great agency to expand state power. War is the health of the state. And so you have the greatest centralization in American history because it's a wartime economy. You have rationing, you have inflation of the currency by the Federal Reserve, you have controlled interest rates, you have every kind of government planning imaginable. And so the public accepts it on the basis of, we got to win the war. Don't you know there's a war on? That famous phrase from my mother's generation. Don't you know there's a war on? Well, of course they know there's a war on. And so from 1942 until 1944, there is no opposition politically. You don't campaign against the president based on the war issue. You're going to lose. You don't campaign against him based on taxation. And so in 1943, a change in taxation takes place. Withholding on the income tax was made as a wartime measure. Of course, it's still with us. Temporary wartime measure never got rid of the thing. We saw immediately the expansion of federal tax collection by about 4 to 1, which means people hadn't been sending in their taxes for the whole period since 1914. As soon as they had withholding by the employers, then all of a sudden the tax revenues really skyrocketed. And they never, of course, came back to lower levels. So you had the expansion of power, and it was scientific power. Certainly the development of the atomic bomb was a remarkable scientific project. And so by 1944, it was clear that Roosevelt was going to be overwhelmingly reelected, that Thomas Dewey running against him was a token candidate. Nobody, including Dewey, expected that he would win it. And Roosevelt did win. And then about the time that the battle for the mind and heart and political commitment of the American citizen was going on, once again, an event took place across the Atlantic which was to have major repercussions. And it was completely unknown at the time. Nobody in the United States knew about this, or if anybody did, it was extremely rare. An obscure professor who had been at the London School of Economics and who had cleared out of London because of the war and who was now at Cambridge, wrote a book titled The Road to Serfdom, and his name was Friedrich August von Hayek, or F.A. Hayek. Hayek wrote this book during the war And he warned that the expansion of government taxation power and regulatory power was the road to serfdom, that it would lead to the loss of civil liberties because the government would control how the money would be spent, and so your ideas to spend it otherwise would be lost, and your cause could be lost if the government got into control of the taxing and spending process. And the road to serfdom was probably the most eloquent defense in just a few hundred pages that had been made of the free market social order ever. Tremendously powerful book written for intellectuals who were not economists. Now, there had been great economic defenses of freedom. Ludwig von Mises, Wilhelm Röpke, men associated with the Austrian economic school of thought, of which Hayek was one. But in terms of writing a book for intelligent intellectuals who were not economists, not trained to think in terms of economic categories, The Road to Serfdom still remains one of the classic statements of a society of individual liberty that has ever been written. And at the same time, in the United States, an obscure newsletter began called Human Events. And Human Events was written by essentially three men, and they were opposed to the expansion of American foreign policy abroad. They wanted to go back to something much more like the 1920s or earlier. They did not trust America as the source of stability and power outside the United States. They saw it as an unwarranted expansion of power. They wanted limited government. They were, in that sense, classical liberals. They were not conservatives, or at least not campaigning as conservatives, because hardly anybody campaigned as conservative. It was not an ideologically developed movement. There was almost no trace of it. But it was tied to what might be called the old right. It was tied to those people who opposed the expansion of domestic federal power and international federal power. They didn't like the American empire, which was rapidly developing, and they didn't like high federal spending for various New Deal projects, domestic projects. Tiny newsletter, almost, of course, nobody'd heard of it. A few hundred people subscribed. It never got very big, but it was a sign that there were at least a few people left who were willing to go into print and say, this thing has got to stop. There's got to be a place where people who don't believe in what is happening can come and read. And only a few hundred people bothered. So this is a very tiny movement. But those two events, the Human Events event in the United States and the publication of The Road to Serfdom, those two events indicated in 1944 that at least possibly there was going to be a change. And if there was going to be a change, then it had to be done through some kind of organized opposition. And this was really the beginning, the very, very beginning of the rise of what we call the modern conservative movement in the United States, the birthing of that movement. And the issues then come out, once again, the big issues: follow the confession, follow the money, and follow the media. And you can't trace the conservative movement without doing that, the modern conservative movement. There wasn't much money. About the only real source of funds was an obscure organization called the William Volker Fund. And the William Volker Fund was in the Midwest. It was a nonprofit outfit. And the founder had been a man who had grown up in Missouri. He had been an opponent of Harry S. Truman. He gave a lot of money away to charitable causes. And his nephew his name was Harold Luno, the nephew, was pretty much a free market type guy. And William Volcker, the founder of the Volcker Fund and the founder of the Volcker Company, very successful company, turned the Volcker Charities organization over to his nephew in 1944. And his nephew, over the next 20 years, was able to put together an organization that began to fund the publication of materials favorable to the rolling back of the federal government. Those materials were mainly economic. They were out of what we might call the libertarian tradition of the United States. They were not Christian. They were not, in the sense, conservative in a Burkean way, but they were certainly Burkean in terms of the call for reduced federal spending and decentralization. A very tiny organization, but there was some money in it. And over the years, in the very early phases, the Volcker money financed a number of enterprises that became very important as the years went on. And I can't think of any other organization in 1944, 1945, that period, that had comparable amount of money where you could say, if you're going to follow the money, you start with Volcker. The only trouble is you cannot follow the money because all the papers disappeared. They were turned over to the Hoover Institution when Volcker Fund, Volcker Organization went out of existence in the mid-1960s. And they were given stock worth tens of millions of dollars. And Hoover Institution took the money, but there is no trace of the papers. So what I'm saying about it only can be found very peripherally in a book about Volcker called Mr. Anonymous, and a few libertarian works that trace a little of the background. But Volcker was where the money initially came from. In terms of follow the confession, Christianity had no part of it. It was not, except insofar as there was kind of a traditional Catholic natural law tradition, but it was not promoted as Catholicism. It was promoted as natural law, which is a tradition that goes back both in Catholicism and in Protestantism. So you had the natural law tradition, natural rights tradition. You had the economists like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, who came to the United States in the early 1940s, and their followers. Henry Hazlitt became certainly associated with the cry to reduce the size of the federal government, to cut taxes and to cut spending. Hazlitt was an important figure in all of this, especially in 1946 when his book came out on Economics in One Lesson. It was a very tiny operation with a few articulate people defending the limited government position in the United States. It was an intellectual movement primarily. It certainly was no grassroots movement. It did not extend down into your local school board. It did not extend into the textbooks. It barely had any books associated with it, a few, but not very many. So you had a little bit of money. The Confession of Faith was basically, at that stage, mid-40s, shrink the government, which means roll back the New Deal. And then you had the media. And about all you had for the media was the newsletter, which was just barely becoming popular. People could afford to put out a newsletter. And then they began occasionally to put out a few books, not very many, because they didn't have publishing houses that would publish this kind of material. So there were very few outlets you could go to in terms of books. You had newsletters. There was radio, and there were a few figures in the radio in the latter part of the 40s. There was no television in the 40s. You couldn't get television. It was a new invention, and only in a few large cities. Certainly it avoided anything like controversial politics. So the media were really limited, And there was hardly anybody there in terms of producing it, let alone reading it. And what you had then, say in 1944, was just a handful of people who were opposed to the New Deal and opposed to the expansion of federal power. And that was it. It was a few intellectuals, a few readers. There was not much. That slowly began to change, but in terms of a movement, it was not visible. It was under the radar of the whole establishment, capital E establishment, the New Deal establishment, which was basically, by that point, both Republican and Democrat. So we have, at that stage, no religious perspective in terms of denominational, any kind of appeal back to classic religious documents. You had the idea of the U.S. Constitution. There were constitutional defenders, which is the individual is sovereign and we, the people, started it. You had the faith, some faith in the Constitution, especially the one that operated before the Supreme Court got a hold of it after 1938. There was some confidence, some minimal confidence that goodness would triumph in the end. There was some degree of optimism that the future would get better. There was a belief in a bottom-up society. They didn't want centralized planning. That's what they didn't want. So the confession was bottom-up, localism, states' rights. But of course, the states' rights argument was still associated in the 1940s with the Civil War, with slavery, with Jim Crow laws, with racism. So even to raise the issue of states' rights almost automatically got you tarred and feathered as a redneck Southern racist. So it was very difficult in terms of the confession of faith to find that public confession to which people would commit money and time and real dedication. They didn't have a slogan other than "that man," and that really is not much of a slogan. You didn't have extreme optimism, but some optimism. But they had been beaten for so long that it looked impossible to turn back the New Deal. So it was more just, can we slow the speed of the process? And so you have a situation in which there was no developed conservative ideology. There were some economists who believed in the free market, but they were not widely read by the public. There were a few ideas that were common, but with the power of the war so great and the power of the federal government so great, that until the war ended, it was clear that there would not be any real discussion of the fundamental issues of what kind of society should exist after the war and what kind of government should exist after the war. It was not until the war ended that the real debate began to take place in the United States. And we'll cover that in the next section.